She showed up in oil-stained coveralls, carrying a dented toolbox, on a runway reserved for billionaires. No one expected her to fix the $72 million jet, let alone expose a corporate scandal that would shake an entire industry. But Danika Rhodes wasn't just a mechanic. She was the mind behind the very system they tried to erase. What began as quiet humiliation would ignite a revolution in innovation, justice, and power. And it all started with a single voice saying, "Let her work." The last thing anyone expected on that glistening tarmac at Southridge Aeronautics Field was for a black woman in oil-streaked coveralls to command the attention of the executive hangar. But when 36-year-old Danika Rhodes stepped out of her dented cargo van and wheeled her scuffed aluminum toolbox across the concrete, the whispers began. Behind the smoked glass of the Sky Lounge, sharply dressed flight directors and engineering leads paused mid-latte, trading looks that blended disbelief and quiet derision. "She can't be the lead technician," muttered a project consultant, adjusting his designer tie. "Not for the Harrington Falcon." The Falcon, a $72 million prototype designed to cut fuel emissions by 40%, had stalled unexpectedly just hours before a global demonstration. Investors, journalists, and engineers from 5 countries were watching. The countdown had already begun. What they didn't know was that Danika Rhodes had reverse-engineered more advanced propulsion systems in her modest basement than most of them had seen in a lab. She had published under aliases, licensed designs under shell LLCs, and survived in a world where her brilliance had to wear camouflage. But this moment wasn't just about a malfunctioning aircraft. It was about what Danika represented and what people feared. Years of coded language and quiet exclusion had taught Danika how to navigate spaces where her skin, gender, and demeanor disqualified her before she spoke. Yet what none of them realized was how those years had also sharpened her instincts. She had learned to read systems, mechanical and human, before they collapsed. As she approached the nose of the Falcon, Danika felt the usual knot in her stomach. Not from doubt, but from something heavier, knowing that every screw she turned would be watched, every decision second-guessed. The psychological weight wasn't new. It came with the unspoken expectation that she not only succeed, but outperform, that she prove herself flawless, so no one like her would be turned away in the future. From the upper deck, however, one pair of eyes watched without contempt. Malcolm Harrington, 48, heir to the aerospace empire, and now its reluctant CEO, stood with arms crossed. Unlike the others, he didn't scoff. He observed, calculated, and then, unexpectedly, he spoke into his lapel mic. "Let her work." The silence that followed was heavy with discomfort. Orders had already been issued for a backup crew to fly in from Houston. But Malcolm's voice cut through those plans. Danika lowered the bay door and immediately saw what no diagnostic had shown: a cascading systems failure in the hybrid coolant regulation unit, misread by others as a software glitch. At 35,000 feet, that error would have triggered a failure chain capable of grounding the entire Harrington line for months. She adjusted the regulator modules with deft precision. No panic, no boasting, just muscle memory and clarity under pressure. The kind forged in isolation, honed under the constant threat of being undermined. By the time she stood and closed the panel, sweat lining her brow, the Falcon system board had cleared. Not a single executive clapped, but Malcolm Harrington was already moving. He descended the stairs, His pace was steady, his face unreadable. "Miss Rhodes," he said, extending a hand. "Walk with me." No one knew what that moment would spark. Not yet. But beneath that tarmac, a cultural reckoning was beginning to smolder, one that would force an entire industry to confront who they excluded and who they had always needed. Danika Rhodes didn't speak as she followed Malcolm Harrington down the narrow corridor that led beneath the hangar. The air cooled the moment they left the tarmac, but the tension didn't. She walked a step behind him, not out of deference, but to watch how the others moved, how they reacted to his silence, how their eyes darted toward her and quickly away. For years, Danika had trained herself to read power in body language, and she could tell that Malcolm wasn't merely curious. He was trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with everything he thought he knew. They entered a private tech suite designed for strategic meetings. The walls were matte black, the lighting soft and indirect. A scale model of the Falcon prototype sat beneath a glass dome, a centerpiece surrounded by touchscreen monitors and schematics. "Sit," Malcolm said quietly, gesturing to one of the chairs. He remained standing, arms folded. "What's your full name?" "Danika Michelle Rhodes," she replied without hesitation. He studied her for a moment longer, then turned toward a sleek digital interface. "I've been reviewing your records, or trying to." Danika waited. "You don't show up in any of the FAA-certified technician rosters for this project," he continued, "but you appear, barely, in a subcontractor log from 5 years ago. You were listed as a junior systems analyst for Henix Technologies, one of our original propulsion R&D partners." Danika gave a small nod. "You designed the Falcon's dual-stage fuel optimization algorithm." "I did." Malcolm tapped a few keys. "That algorithm's final implementation was attributed to George Kellerman. He won an industry award for it." Danika's face remained impassive, though her right hand tightened slightly against her thigh. "He reused 87% of my model and adjusted the final coefficients. And you didn't come forward." "I did. I submitted a complaint through internal channels." Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "A week later, my contract wasn't renewed. I was told I lacked collaborative spirit." Malcolm exhaled. "Do you have documentation?" "I have everything. Design logs, change histories, internal memos, even the original code modules, time-stamped and signed. I built redundancy backups from the beginning. You learn to do that when your ideas get stolen." His eyes narrowed. "Why keep working in the field? As a mechanic?" "Because no one hires black women to lead innovation in aerospace. Not when you show up in a used van and wear your hair natural. Mechanics can pay their bills, but real power comes when you stop waiting for recognition and start collecting leverage." That line hit harder than Malcolm expected. The room was silent for several seconds. "I don't suppose you recorded anything?" Danika raised an eyebrow. "I record everything." Malcolm didn't smile, but his tone shifted slightly. "You know, my father designed this room for confrontation. Said the truth always reveals itself in quiet spaces. I never thought I'd use it for this." Danika met his gaze directly. "Your father also built a company that rewarded theft and called it meritocracy." That did make Malcolm flinch. Slightly. He sat down across from her and tapped his earpiece. "Elaine, send Dr. Cross to the suite. Bring legal." Dr. Shana Cross entered within minutes, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and a presence that made the air feel sharper. She carried a tablet and a legal folder thick with flagged documents. "Ms. Rhodes," she said as she sat, "I've reviewed your archive. Your contributions to the Falcon program meet every threshold for intellectual property misappropriation." Danika didn't answer. She didn't need to. "We're prepared to offer financial restitution," Shayna continued, "and full retroactive credit. But there's more at stake here than your individual case." Malcolm nodded. "We've found a pattern. Over the past decade, more than a dozen innovations were credited to senior engineers, most of them white, male, and highly visible. In at least 5 of those cases, the original contributors were contractors or junior staff from marginalized backgrounds." Danika had suspected as much. What she hadn't expected was the level of validation, or the growing suspicion in Malcolm's eyes that something much deeper had rotted beneath his company's gleaming reputation. "And what do you want from me?" she asked finally. Shayna leaned forward. "Your cooperation, your documentation, and your leadership. Malcolm is proposing a new internal division, Innovation, Ethics, and Attribution. We want you to lead it." Danika blinked. "You want the woman in coveralls to lead a department that reports directly to your board?" "We want the engineer who built our most successful system and survived this company's worst habits," Malcolm replied. "But more than that, we need to be held accountable by someone who sees the patterns we missed or ignored." Danika studied them both. She thought of the mechanics she worked beside, brilliant minds overlooked because of the zip codes they came from. She thought of her niece, about to enter college on a scholarship Danika had quietly funded. And she thought of her mother, who used to scrub office floors so Danika could stay up late building model engines out of recycled parts. "This can't just be about cleaning up the past," she said. "I want a mandate to shape the future, talent development, community pipelines, patent audits, anonymous innovation logs for all contract employees, and a seat at the executive round table, not as decoration." Shayna looked to Malcolm. He nodded. "You'll have it." Danika stood, adjusted the cuffs of her sleeves, and reached for the folder. "Then let's start with page 1. What neither of them saw from the high-security feed room above was George Kellerman watching the interaction through a surveillance terminal, his lips pursed, eyes calculating. He had thought Danika Rhodes was gone, swept under the rug like so many others. But now she was rising, and George had secrets buried deeper than anyone imagined. George Kellerman didn't knock. He barged into the executive suite with a practiced swagger, his charcoal blazer still crisp, from a midday interview with a trade publication. The smile he wore was thin, the kind that suggested control, not warmth. His eyes locked onto Danika, then flicked toward Malcolm and Shayna. Suspicion clouded his expression as he slowed his stride. "What's going on here?" he asked, tone flat but laced with performative concern. "I thought this room was secured for executive-level briefings only." Malcolm stood slowly. "It is." Kellerman's lips thinned further. "Then why is a contractor in coveralls sitting in the confrontation suite?" "Because she just confirmed that the Falcon's propulsion optimization algorithm was hers, not yours," Malcolm replied. The silence was immediate and volatile. Kellerman's eyebrows lifted, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry. Are we seriously entertaining this? She was an assistant contractor, barely involved with the testing phase." Danika remained seated, hands folded on her lap, voice calm. Then explained the version histories on the source code. Each module was uploaded from my encrypted dev stack. That's ridiculous, Kellerman snapped. Those logs could have been doctored. Do you have any idea how IP law works? Shayna Cross cleared her throat. We do, which is why we've already verified the timestamps through our internal audit software. And I've cross-checked the project directories. They trace back to Ms. Rhodes's individual access account before you logged into the files. Kellerman's facade cracked. His right hand gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white. George, Malcolm said, voice steady, we also pulled your email traffic from the 2 weeks surrounding the final Falcon prototype submission. Would you like to explain why you recommended Danika's removal for poor team fit just 3 days after she submitted the core algorithm? Kellerman's jaw tensed. She was uncooperative, dismissive. She was accurate, Shayna cut in, and your team applied her model with minimal adjustments. Our legal review deems your claim of sole authorship legally indefensible. Danika rose now, slow and deliberate. I asked for a meeting 5 years ago. Your team ghosted me. I asked again last year when the Falcon was shortlisted for global awards. No reply. I sent proof. Still nothing. This, she pointed around the room, is not a surprise to me. It's your reckoning, not mine. Kellerman opened his mouth to protest, but the door swung open again. This time it was 2 board members, Lana Park and Omar Delgado, summoned quietly by Malcolm hours earlier, now arriving in silent coordination. Omar looked directly at George. We've seen the files. And the recordings, Lena added. Your private messages mocking Danika's qualifications, and the Slack thread you started, how to erase a nobody. Kellerman's face went ashen. That was sarcasm, a joke. It wasn't funny, Omar replied. Shayna dropped a printed dossier onto the conference table. This includes 3 cases over the past 8 years where junior staff filed formal complaints about innovation theft linked to your teams. All quietly closed without resolution, but now, with Danika's case verified and precedent established, you're finished, Malcolm said bluntly. George Kellerman's career didn't end with a bang, but with the echo of a revoked security badge and the dull buzz of silence. He was escorted out of the facility 2 hours later, under a quiet HR directive, flanked by legal observers and watched by staff who whispered his name like a cautionary tale. But for Danika, the moment brought no celebration, only a long, quiet exhale and the start of a different kind of work. The following morning, an emergency board meeting was convened to address the fallout. Danika sat near the back, flanked by her new compliance liaison and 2 advisors from a civil rights tech coalition recently brought in to consult. Malcolm stood at the front of the sleek, glass-paneled boardroom. This is not about a single project or a single employee, he said. It's about culture, about who we choose to listen to and who we conveniently forget. Danika Rhodes built the system that anchors our most valuable aircraft. She was buried, ignored, and nearly erased by our own processes. That ends today. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, not universal, but louder than expected. Danika stood, her presence commanding now, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't need to. You all asked how something like this could happen without anyone noticing. The truth? It's not that you didn't notice. It's that you didn't believe it mattered. Innovation doesn't have a dress code. Genius doesn't only come in pressed suits. She held up a small flash drive. This contains copies of 5 more cases, not just mine, others you need to hear about. Malcolm nodded toward Shayna. We're launching a full forensic audit of all innovation filings from the past decade, effective immediately. And we'll be forming a new oversight body, Lena Park added, co-chaired by Danika, with full decision-making authority. Not everyone in the room looked pleased. A few shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking downward, but no one spoke in opposition. Outside the boardroom, the story was already breaking across tech media outlets. Headlines ran with terms like "Stolen Genius," "The Woman Who Fixed the Future," and "Inside Aerospace's Quiet Reckoning." Danika didn't read the articles that morning. She was already on a call with a STEM outreach nonprofit, arranging a meeting to fund pilot programs in low-income high schools. Because her mission had never been just about reclaiming credit. It was about ensuring no one else would have to fight this kind of battle just to be seen. Danika Rhodes sat alone in the quiet of her newly designated office, the plaque still temporary on the door, Director of Innovation Ethics and Equity. The hum of the building around her, the very one that had once dismissed her existence, felt unfamiliar in this new context. She wasn't just a technician anymore. She was a disruption, a symbol, a beginning. But what came next, she knew, would be far harder than unmasking one man. The documents she'd carried for years, blueprints, emails, source code, voice recordings, were just the start. Since her exposure of George Kellerman, dozens of emails had flooded her inbox. Some from anonymous engineers, some from former interns, others from contract staff, quietly phased out after submitting ideas that mysteriously surfaced under different names months later. Each message painted a pattern. The same thin excuses: didn't fit the team, lacked collaboration, too junior to lead, delivered with the same results. Innovation stolen, credit reassigned, careers stalled before they could begin. Danika called it intellectual laundering, and it wasn't unique to aerospace. She brought this to Malcolm Harrington and Dr. Shayna Cross in a closed-door meeting. They sat still as she laid out not only what had happened, but how it had happened. Systemically, procedurally, and most dangerously, culturally. "This is not about one executive or even one department," she said. "It's about how this entire industry defines genius, how it's coded in resumes, filtered by accent, measured in handshake strength." Dr. Cross leaned forward. "You're saying the problem isn't who stole the credit. It's the system that made it easy and expected." "Exactly," Danika replied. "The system didn't fail. It performed exactly as it was designed, to protect power and keep innovation gate-kept." What followed was a sweeping internal audit, not just of intellectual property records, but of hiring, retention, and promotion practices. The results were staggering. Across a 12-year span, 71% of innovation proposals submitted by contract or junior staff from underrepresented communities had been reassigned to senior engineers before final patent or production stage. Many of those proposals were later used in successful commercial applications. But the statistics weren't just numbers. They were stories, names, faces. Danika created a confidential review task force, bringing in external experts in organizational bias, intellectual property law, and workplace psychology. One report outlined how micro-doubt and credential bias disproportionately affected employees of color in technical environments, leading to excessive oversight, delayed credit attribution, and unwarranted dismissal. She already knew this, of course. She had lived it. But now it was quantified, validated, impossible to ignore. However, as the truth emerged, so did resistance. Anonymous memos circulated, accusing the leadership of weaponizing diversity. Some executives privately expressed concern that Danika's presence had created a culture of fear. A few attempted to slow-walk cooperation with the task force, citing legal risk. This was the backlash, subtle, coded, but no less dangerous. Still, Danika remained unmoved. To counter tokenism, she insisted on a permanent innovation review council with independent oversight, empowered to intervene in all future patent disputes. She pushed for a blind submission protocol, removing names and departments from all innovation proposals during initial evaluation phases. She also partnered with 2 national universities to create fellowship pipelines for engineering students from historically underfunded schools, ensuring access to top internships without legacy-based referral systems. But perhaps the boldest move came in her proposal for a corporate memory registry, a blockchain-based system to timestamp and track all technical submissions, tying credit to creators at every stage of development. It was transparent, immutable, and publicly viewable within the company. The board was hesitant. Legal flagged the risks, but Malcolm approved it. Visibility, he said, echoing one of her earlier words, is the first form of justice. Yet Danika wasn't driven by theory or policy frameworks. She was haunted by memory, by the look in the eyes of a young Latina engineer she met in the cafeteria, whose idea for a diagnostic algorithm had been shelved, then mysteriously resurfaced a year later under a director's name. Danika offered her a mentorship role on the task force. "I don't want this to be about me," the engineer had whispered. "I know," Danika said, "but for now let it start with you." Because the danger of systemic injustice isn't just in what it destroys, it's in what it convinces people they aren't allowed to build. By the time the quarterly shareholder report went public, Evans Aeronautics had become an unexpected case study in corporate reckoning. News outlets ran headlines like "From Theft to Reform" and "The Industry Blueprint for Innovation Accountability." Still, the numbers told the more compelling story. In just 6 months, attrition among junior engineers dropped by 41%. Submissions from marginalized contributors rose by over 60%. 3 previously overlooked propulsion designs had been fast-tracked for funding and testing. Danika never gave a press conference, but she did appear, quietly, at a small classroom in East Baltimore, teaching middle school students how to design simple engines with recyclable materials. When asked by one student why she was there instead of being rich at a jet company, Danika smiled, because a system isn't fixed until the people outside it can thrive too. Just as Danika Rhodes began reshaping the internal DNA of Evans Aeronautics, retaliation arrived, not with loud denials or lawsuits, but with precision and plausible deniability. Anonymous reports were filed, questioning the legality of the corporate memory registry. One legal blog suggested Danika's reform protocols violated trade secret protections. Then came a flurry of concerned investor letters implying that her leadership was compromising the company's competitive edge. Malcolm Harrington received a midnight email from an old family advisor titled "The Danger of Overcorrecting." It was coordinated, and Danika knew exactly where it was coming from. George Kellerman, once quietly dismissed, was not done. While officially barred from re-entering the industry, He had rallied disaffected former executives and consultants, those who had quietly profited from the old order. Through offshore shell companies and ghost partners, they were feeding smear campaigns to conservative media outlets and tech industry watchdogs. The narratives were subtle but corrosive. Is Evans Aeronautics sacrificing innovation for identity? Token leadership in aerospace? And can a technician really run reform? Danika expected this. She had already begun her counter-strategy months earlier, documenting every reform measure, every improved metric, and every case of previously overlooked talent, now accelerating product development. But she also knew this wasn't just about Evans. It was about setting a precedent that other companies would watch, and some would want to destroy. So she went national. In partnership with civil rights tech coalitions and academic institutions, Danika organized the first Innovation Integrity Summit, hosted in Chicago. CEOs, engineers, ethicists, and students gathered under one purpose: to redefine how corporate America honors ingenuity. The summit was live-streamed and trended globally within hours. Danika took the stage not in a blazer, but in the same dark utility coveralls she had worn on the day she fixed the Falcon. "My credentials," she began, "were never lost. They were ignored, because our industry measures credibility in suits, not solutions." She then unveiled the Ethical Innovation Framework, a voluntary but open-sourced protocol for tracking, crediting, and protecting intellectual contributions at every level. 6 companies signed on before the summit ended. Within 3 weeks, 12 more followed. Meanwhile, Evans Aeronautics published a transparency report detailing the recovery of over 40 misattributed innovations and the implementation of redress mechanisms for affected contributors. It was the first report of its kind in the sector. But not everyone cheered. A powerful corporate trade alliance quietly pulled Evans from its annual award consideration. A lead investor from a rival firm withdrew $20 million in long-term partnership funding. Board members who had once voted in favor of Danika's appointment began requesting restructuring conversations. Malcolm stood firm. He released a statement that turned heads in Wall Street Journal editorials. "If integrity costs us capital, then we were funded by the wrong partners." Yet the pressure escalated. A confidential memo leaked from one of Kellerman's affiliates suggested the next move would be legal, leveraging IP gray zones and old employment clauses to undermine the corporate memory registry. Danika responded with a move no one anticipated. She unsealed 5 years' worth of design files from her personal archive. Innovations, simulations, and systems concepts developed in her own time, on her own equipment, never under corporate employment. The files, released under Creative Commons for academic and non-profit use, triggered a frenzy in the engineering world. It was an act of radical transparency. It also sent a message. She hadn't just risen through reform. She'd always had the power to lead innovation. She had just chosen to share it, rather than hoard it. Within a month, 2 of her open-source models were adopted by startups developing low-emission aviation solutions in Southeast Asia. She refused royalties. Instead, she asked for proof that the interns and junior contributors would be credited first. Her model was working, but perhaps the most dramatic shift came internally. Evans's newest jet prototype, Phoenix X, designed under Danika's new cross-cultural development team, outperformed its competitors in both efficiency and cost by 18%. And it was built not by Ivy League pedigree, but by engineers trained through Evans's new pipeline initiative, graduates of state colleges, community colleges, and formerly incarcerated tech program alumni. The board reconvened, this time not to restructure her out, but to offer her equity. Danika refused it, at least in the traditional sense. "I don't want stock, I want stake," she said, "in the form of a permanent seat on the governance board for inclusive engineering practice, and I want veto power over any policy that undermines innovation transparency." It was bold, it was risky, it passed by a 9-2 vote. 6 months after the first attacks began, the same outlets that once questioned Danika's credentials now ran stories under headlines like "The Blueprint for Ethical Engineering" and "How One Mechanic Changed an Industry." But Danika rarely engaged with media. Instead, she walked the factory floor, clipboard in hand, interviewing welders, coders, and design interns. She watched how they interacted, listened to how they critiqued each other. She cared less about quarterly returns than about whether everyone in the room felt like they were allowed to speak. Because in the end, industry reform isn't born in a press release. It starts in the moments where someone finally believes, maybe for the first time, that their voice matters. The anniversary event didn't begin with fanfare. No string quartet, no dramatic drone footage sweeping across the skyline. Just the soft murmur of engineers, technicians, policy analysts, and community leaders filing into the newly renovated Evans Aeronautics Learning and Innovation Center. Danika Rhodes stood at the edge of the main atrium, flanked by students from the company's mentorship initiative, young people who, just a year ago, hadn't imagined themselves belonging anywhere near the aerospace industry. Now they were helping unveil the Phoenix X propulsion system, a design team project that had rewritten expectations of what non-traditional engineers could create. The audience included shareholders, press, and government officials. But Danika focused on the people who wouldn't normally get a seat. Custodians, line workers, interns. That was intentional. This wasn't a celebration of power. It was a recalibration of who deserved to be seen. When Malcolm Harrington stepped to the stage, he didn't carry his usual poise. He looked humbled, and when he gestured for silence, the crowd responded with attention, not applause. "1 year ago," he began, "a woman walked onto one of our runways and changed the course of this company, not just with a wrench, not just with a file archive, but with clarity and courage. Danika didn't just fix a jet. She forced us to confront who we had become and who we needed to be." He stepped aside as the spotlight shifted. Danika approached the podium slowly, holding a small object in her hand, a charred ID badge, cracked at the edges, the one she had been told to return when she was dismissed 5 years earlier. She held it up. "I was told I didn't belong here," she said, voice steady, but what they meant was I didn't look like I belonged. I didn't fit the image of genius that this industry was comfortable praising. The room stilled, and I wasn't the only one. Behind her, a screen illuminated with the names and photos of 37 former employees whose work had been misattributed, buried, or suppressed. Most were black or Latino. Most were women. Many had never returned to engineering, but each one had contributed to systems, patents, and advancements that had become foundational to Evans Aeronautics' product line. "The truth isn't uncomfortable because it's harsh," Danika continued. "It's uncomfortable because it's overdue." She detailed the success of the Innovation Registry, The increases in retention and idea attribution, and the measurable gains in product performance linked to more inclusive teams. But her voice never swelled with pride, only clarity. We didn't just change our process, we changed our premise. The reaction was swift and global. Over the next 48 hours, aerospace firms across Europe and Asia released statements pledging to audit their innovation pipelines. 3 U.S. defense contractors announced new oversight boards. A tech conglomerate in California adopted the ethical innovation framework wholesale. Social media exploded with the hashtag number from toolbox to boardroom, used not just by engineers but by nurses, coders, warehouse workers, people in industries where talent had long been overlooked because it didn't arrive in polished packaging. But not everyone was moved. An op-ed in a legacy trade journal accused Evans of corporate confession theater. A few conservative political figures labeled Danika's reforms as DEI extremism in disguise. Even some investors remained skeptical, citing the company's slight revenue dip during its year of transformation. Danika, however, wasn't interested in appeasing every critic. She was focused on endurance, not applause. She used the moment to launch a new initiative, the Open Circuit Lab, a public-private research and development space where students, retirees, self-taught engineers, and even formerly incarcerated individuals could submit concepts for review and refinement, with guaranteed attribution. The lab's first pilot, an energy-efficient landing gear sensor designed by a 17-year-old from Detroit, received a $75,000 development grant within 2 weeks. Meanwhile, internal changes continued. Evans Aeronautics restructured its executive promotion protocols, requiring documented contributions to mentorship and innovation equity. All managers underwent certification in bias recognition and inclusive collaboration. Performance reviews now measured not just results, but ethical process. 1 year after Danika's return, more than 38% of all new hires were from historically underrepresented backgrounds, and the company had achieved its highest employee satisfaction rating in 15 years. But the most emotional moment came after the event, in a quiet corner of the Innovation Center. Danika sat beside her mother, Ms. Evelyn Rhodes, 74, retired hospital cleaner, now local legend. Evelyn looked around the soaring glass atrium and said softly, "I used to scrub these kinds of floors. Now you design what flies above them." Danika blinked back tears. "You lifted me long before I ever took off." Photos of that moment, mother and daughter, side by side, beneath a ceiling of suspended jet turbines and solar wings, became symbolic across news outlets, not as a tale of individual glory, but as a representation of intergenerational resilience. Still, Danika remained wary of becoming a brand. She turned down every offer for a book deal, declined speaking tours, and refused to be profiled by any publication that didn't agree to also feature at least 3 other engineers from her team. Because it wasn't her name that mattered. It was what the name had come to stand for. Malcolm, now just months from stepping down as CEO, offered her a chance to take the role. Danika refused, politely, firmly. "Reform doesn't belong behind the biggest desk," she said. "It belongs on the floor, on the tarmac, in the lab, wherever the first no usually shows up." Instead, she proposed rotating leadership, an experimental governance model designed to reduce entrenchment and invite fresh perspectives every 5 years. The board was hesitant. Legal flagged it again, but Malcolm, perhaps knowing this was his final act, cast the decisive vote. Yes. And so, Evans Aeronautics not only became the first aerospace firm to adopt a living innovation audit, but the first to codify periodic power redistribution in executive succession. Danika returned to her work, clipboard in hand, listening more than talking, because change doesn't always look like disruption. Sometimes it looks like an open door that finally stays open. 1 year after the Phoenix X unveiling, the story of Danika Rhodes had already become embedded in classrooms, community centers, and think tanks around the world, not as folklore, but as functional blueprint. Yet Danika never called it a legacy. That word, she said, sounded too final. For her, the work was only beginning. The open-circuit lab expanded into 5 cities, each one located in a neighborhood historically excluded from aerospace opportunity. Danika personally oversaw the design of every lab, from the ergonomics of the benches to the placement of the chalkboards, ensuring it felt more like a workshop than a lecture hall. Inside these spaces, welders brainstormed beside coders. Formerly incarcerated veterans sketched propulsion ideas next to public school sophomores. There were no titles on name tags, just first names and access to equipment. But the most striking thing about these labs wasn't the innovation. It was the conversations. Older engineers, long cast aside, found new life mentoring the next generation. Young minds challenged old paradigms not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. They had never been told what they weren't allowed to know. Danika visited each location once a month, never announcing her arrival. She would slip in quietly, dressed as she always was, functional over formal, and sit among the learners, listening, asking questions, offering guidance only when invited. She didn't position herself as the hero. She positioned herself as the blueprint, and the proof of concept was working. In just under 12 months, the labs produced 19 patent-pending submissions, 6 functional prototypes, and a new training standard for hybrid engine maintenance, now under review by the FAA. But the real success couldn't be measured in filings. It was in the moment when a 12-year-old girl from Baton Rouge built a modular flight stabilizer and said aloud, "I didn't know I was allowed to be this good at this." Danika smiled quietly when she heard it. That was the real milestone. Meanwhile, Evans Aeronautics continued to evolve under its rotating executive model. The second chair was filled by a former quality inspector who had once taken night classes in systems theory, now serving a 2-year term as co-lead of innovation direction. Other companies began testing similar rotational strategies, many citing Evans as the catalyst. Still, public perception was divided. Some critics claimed the reforms were unsustainable. Others accused Danika of quietly politicizing STEM. One editorial described her methods as too idealistic to scale. She didn't reply to any of it, because for every detractor there were thousands who showed up. Young people filling aviation programs, submitting independent designs, requesting internships at Evans, not because they wanted a name on a jet, but because they now believed the door might actually be open. Danika also began advising national policy initiatives. Her focus, creating federal incentives for companies that implement ethical IP tracking, inclusive innovation audits, and cross-community R&D investments. She didn't lobby for favors, only for fairness, and she refused to do it behind closed doors. Every policy proposal she submitted was published publicly, with annotations. By year's end, Several bipartisan lawmakers adopted her framework into a legislative package titled the Transparent Innovation Act, aimed at strengthening attribution protections and expanding STEM funding in underserved districts. It was a small victory, but a structural one. Still, Danika remained tethered to her roots. She returned often to the small brick home where she first disassembled a vacuum motor at age 8. Her mother still lived there, the garden blooming wild with marigolds and solar panels now lining the roof. Donated by a group of interns who had once shadowed Danika at the open circuit lab. And every Friday night, she taught a quiet mechanics class in the basement of a local church. No cameras, no press, just wrenches, open laptops, and black coffee. One student, a teen on probation, asked her, "How do you know this isn't just a phase, that it'll last?" Danika answered without hesitation, "Because it's not about one of us making it. It's about none of us needing permission again." That idea, that dignity could be engineered just like lift or fuel efficiency, became the soul of her philosophy. And it wasn't just influencing engineering. Law schools began citing the Evans case study in intellectual property ethics modules. Business schools reframed Danika's strategy as a model of values-driven restructuring. Even entertainment began shifting. A streaming platform released a limited series inspired by her story, not as a biography, but as a speculative drama exploring what happens when equity becomes design, not apology. But the true impact would come years later in ways she'd never witness. A child reading about propulsion not from a textbook, but from a zine printed in the lab. A single mother teaching her daughter CAD software because no one had ever told her it was out of reach. An aging machinist who, realizing his overlooked designs, might finally find daylight. This was Danika's revolution, not loud, not explosive, but structural. And as the sun set on the second year of the Evans transformation, she stood quietly on a rooftop overlooking the Baltimore skyline. Beside her was a new intern, clipboard in hand, nervously pitching an idea. Danika listened, then said, "Sketch it, build it, we'll test it next week." No grand speech, no sweeping gesture, just one more barrier gone, and one more voice rising in its place. In the years to come, Danika Rhodes would be credited with transforming Evans Aeronautics from a symbol of silent exclusion into a case study in living reform. But long after the headlines faded and the hashtags quieted, what remained wasn't the applause, it was the architecture, not the buildings, but the systems, not the milestones, but the doors she refused to let close. Danika had proven what many feared and few admitted, that injustice in innovation wasn't an accident. It was engineered, by omission, by hierarchy, by convenience, and because it was engineered, it could be redesigned. Her story wasn't about exceptionalism. It wasn't the tale of one genius breaking through against all odds. It was the disruption of the very idea that brilliance had to look, sound, or dress a certain way. Danika didn't overcome barriers for herself. She dismantled them so no one else would have to. What made her different wasn't her intellect. It was her refusal to center herself in her own legacy. She understood that justice isn't a moment. It's a method. That method reshaped how a global corporation credited ideas, invested in potential, and evaluated leadership. It inspired cross-industry reform, not because it sought pity or punishment, but because it offered something rare, a roadmap that was both ethical and effective. And it all began on a tarmac, with one woman, in coveralls, holding a wrench. That single act, stepping forward into a space that tried to erase her, didn't just fix a jet. It revealed the structural fault lines of an entire ecosystem, and instead of retreating, Danika exposed them, rewired them, rebuilt them. But perhaps her most radical act was her commitment to continuity. She didn't let the movement end with her promotion. She refused to be tokenized, glorified, or mythologized, because she knew that when justice becomes a spectacle, it stops being accessible. So she passed it forward, in labs, in policies, in mentorship. She democratized innovation and refused to hoard credit. Today, Evans Aeronautics operates with systems that trace the origin of every idea submitted, automatically attributing authorship and preserving credit trails. More than 24 Fortune 500 companies have adopted the ethical innovation framework born from Danika's reforms. Congressional hearings cite her testimony when debating patent protection and equity enforcement. And yet, if you were to ask her what mattered most, she'd point not to numbers or policies, but to the quiet changes. The high schooler who applied to aerospace school after seeing someone like them on a leadership roster. The janitor who filed an idea and got it approved on merit. The middle manager who stopped gatekeeping and started mentoring. Because those shifts, intimate, invisible, irreversible, are where real change lives. Danika's journey didn't end with triumph. It evolved into stewardship, a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in control, but in design, one that asked not, "How do I win?" but, "How do we not lose each other in the process?" From injustice to innovation, from invisibility to impact, from a system that erased people to one that remembers them, by name, by contribution, by dignity. Danika Rhodes didn't just challenge an industry. She redesigned its foundation, and the future it now holds was built, at last, to hold everyone.